experts from academia and industry here on our beautiful campus. Very warm welcome from my side. Now, having spent the last 3 decades working in and for the tech industry, and of course looking forward to my new assignment, I truly acknowledge and appreciate the many opportunities and benefits digitalization offers for creating societal as well as business value. For me personally, innovation means value creation. However, we must say that in this world of Internet 4.0, the Internet of everything, and the world of continuous integration of products, of services, of people, in this always connected Internet of everything, we are facing completely new challenges which come at a quite high cost. Just think how easy it is today to spread lies about people and destroy their reputation in just a few minutes. The digitalization of the world has led to the application of technology to every sphere of the human life and endeavor, and law is not an exception here. Law and technology have quite a history embedded in subject areas such as legal informatics, legal information, technology law, and other similar denominations. And as you all know, the concept of legal informatics is not new. The history of legal informatics is traceable to the foundation of the relationship between law and computers and dates to the mid-50s. But its importance is greater than ever due to recent technological advances, including progress on mechanized legal information processing, the growth of the Internet, and the proliferation of the autonomous systems, such as self-driving cars and, of course, robots, as well as, of course, the globalization of the legal industry. The consequence of these advances is the emergence of practical legal technology that is for sure qualitatively superior to what has gone before. The technology is capable of dramatically changing the legal profession. I'm sure you're all experiencing this, improving the quality and the efficiency of legal services and disrupting the way law firms do business. An excellent example are solutions for the legal profession tapping the power of natural language processing and understanding, which can quickly comprehend and analyze structured and unstructured information in legal documents, thus enabling attorneys to spend more time on work that adds true value to client relationships. Technology is also capable of popularizing the law, bringing legal understanding and legal tools to everyone in society, which is important, and not just to legal professionals. Topics such as data ethics, which go beyond legal compliance and focus on emerging issues and concerns related to the processing of personal data, and ethics of artificial intelligence are gaining interest among academics, companies, and of course EU regulators. I personally believe that artificial intelligence is the greatest technology disruptor the legal field has seen. And yes, a lot has happened in the area of artificial intelligence and law research during the last 30 years. But as you might know, for a long time, the results were largely ignored by legal practice. But now both the technological environment and the applications have progressed sufficiently to be used in a day-to-day business, significantly increasing efficiency and reducing cost. Due to the rapid and pervasive deployment of artificial intelligence technologies within industrial products that we can find in our everyday life, and I guess each of you has at least one smartphone, information technology law and the research area concerned with ethics in law for information technologies has recently gained increasing interest. Here I would like to mention a couple of the most popular use cases in law and ethics for science and technology. If we look into the field of autonomous systems such as robots and self-driving cars, I believe that this constitutes the most pressing application area, calling for the development of legal and ethical reasoning in machines. If we look into decision support systems, artificial intelligence technology is utilized as a core competence of DSS and in algorithm-based decision-making. Algorithm-based decision-making is a phenomenon which is spreading in various areas of regulation, including banking and financial regulation, but of course also in criminal law, such as the detection of market manipulations. And you will hear much more about AR in the course of the next 2 days. What about the healthcare industry? Establishing autonomous systems in healthcare, especially for the personal assistance of individuals, inherently exhibits the danger of the so-called dehumanization through the lack of social contact. But we all know that human contact is really essential in care. Replacing humans by robots and AI technology can dehumanize care, but on the other hand, also improve in it by a more reliable form of assistance and supervision of the patients. And I already mentioned the fintech industry. Complex regulatory frameworks have been defined to prevent developments that might disrupt the smooth and fair functioning of our financial systems. However, reporting needed for transparency, compliance, and explanation is very extensive and elaborate when done by humans. On the other hand, risk assessment can increasingly be supported by machine learning means. Both ethical and legal issues are arising. Now, what about data protection and the social web? Naive usage and processing of information in the social web and the internet in general is filled with risks. For example, predictions learned from available data may be significantly biased against minorities, and their unreflected use may even amplify discrimination and inequality. Social bots may try to influence public opinion, and we're just in front of elections next week in Austria. Our e-personalities may be attacked in social networks, and of course our e-identities may be stolen and misused. The growing clandestine surveillance and control are menacing without privacy-friendly solutions. Now, with the new GDPR and the intended adoption of the e-privacy regulation, the legal instruments have been placed on new footings, which is good. The implementation still raises many questions and demands for collaborative solutions in practice, particularly regarding privacy by design, data protection and social networks, data retention, the right to be forgotten, just to name a few. I deliberately chose these examples to demonstrate the two sides of the coin and the challenges we need to solve, both from a societal, from a legal, but also from a technology perspective. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, it is really essential to scientifically monitor this hype so as to lower excessive expectations and to fully exploit the opportunities, because there are a lot of opportunities. IT informatics and legal tech are not a mere technical phenomenon. They raise questions regarding fundamental rights and legal theory. And this brings us to the objective of today's conference, which aims at opening up the discussion in an academic context using a very new format. ReMeP 2019 is a first of its kind, and as I said previously, it connects researchers working on specific legal informatics projects with businesses, and I see some very well-known faces here, with businesses looking for solutions to digitalize certain tasks. And it really is a great platform for dissemination and networking aimed to foster the collaboration between IT and legal experts. And I'm sure that ReMeP will also provide you with a diverse and interdisciplinary experience. By now, I guess that all of you are familiar with the format and the agenda and the conference details. And as I said, the format is very special. And it is composed of very many interesting keynotes delivered by experts, but also comprises breakout sessions where researchers are going to present their legal work in IT. And of course, for those who could not be on site, which is a pity, but it's good for the CO2 emissions, for those we are doing also a live stream. Now, I would especially like to thank the organizers of this event, and foremost Dr. Stefan Eder, partner at Benachrichtigung Rechtsanwälte and chair of the committee. Thank you very much for your personal engagement. Professor Erich Schweighofer, Working Group Legal Informatics, Department of European and International and Comparative Law at the University of Vienna. Welcome, Professor Schweighofer. As well as our co-hosts from our university, Professor Susanne Karls from the Institute of Business Law. She is not here at the moment, but she will be joining later on. And of course, Professor Martin Wiener from the Institute of Information and Communication Technology and Intellectual Property Law Group at our university. So thank you very much. And you all, together with your teams, have really put a lot of effort, I know that, in organizing this conference. And I would, of course, like to thank all the teams who were involved here, and I think they have done a great job. But now I would like to welcome all of you and say thank you that you're here. And of course, I think you will have 2 great days and a wonderful evening. I've seen that you'll be at the Rathaus with a nice reception from the mayor. So thank you for joining. Very warm welcome from my side, and all the best for the next 2 days. And now I would like to pass on to Dr. Eder, who will do also a couple of opening comments. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen.
Was muss ich tun? Das ist mein... Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you, dear participants. Magister Opitz, thank you for the warm welcome. And I, on my side, of course, for the organizers, would like to welcome you. Magister Opitz, it was admirable. Your research was great. It is obvious why the university needed to retain you. With your IT experience, the business background, because one couldn't have better described what the issues at hand are than you did. Thank you very much. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you will think, you know, why just another, if that works. No? Yeah. Okay. Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, technique is, even if you have studied informatics, it's not easy at the beginning. So we try to be the first of our kind. We communicate with our audience. That's why we have a hashtag. So if you, and I encourage you, of course, post anything, please use our hashtag ReMeP 2019 so that the community can follow wherever it is. It was already mentioned we had a very good reception for our idea, for this concept. Erich Schweighofer and myself, we attended Zurich's 2018, where we spontaneously sort of created sort of this concept in a sort of discussion, and we pushed it out. I was wondering with the idea for another 10 years. I had been in law management for a long time. 10 years ago, with a group of partners, we decided to set up a smaller firm, and in parallel, I started to run a legal informatics center, a tech center, where we have 18 servers and do all sorts of services around legal, rather from the technical and computer side. It was obvious when we test one or the other application that people in the market don't know what's out there. A lot of very expensive tools are being offered and discussed. Nobody can afford them, and the cheap tools nobody knows. And there is a missing link between the various areas of offerings. And likewise, people don't know what's happening on the research side. So very often you get products offered that solve a particular problem, sort documents, find a clause somewhere, manage discovery or similar processes, but nobody, for example, thinks about why don't we manage a legal process? Why don't we manage a loan agreement from its inception, term sheet creation, execution, management of the loan, watching out for payments, repayments, which we could do, for example, on a blockchain, down to the end of repayment and releasing security. Why isn't anybody, for example, looking at this sort of processes? That is because we don't interact. Lawyers are in a silo. Ms. Opitz made it very clear. Law firms are late adopters. At the moment, law firms think if they are driving legal innovation on the technical side, they would then still command the market, which, dear friends, it will not happen for a simple reason. None of you has more than 0.something% of a market share, and we all know that doesn't scale. Informatics need to scale, and you scale with 10, 15, 20, 30%, but not with 0-something. So what we need is interaction, and that is why we wanted to bring the communities together, because only if you bring the communities together, you will have an evolving environment and problems will get solved. And informatics works different than the law. In the law, you are protective, you protect your knowledge, you make sure it doesn't go out there. You could get copied, somebody else could hijack your client or so. Informatics works differently, right? If you look in successful environments, look into AI, then if you share technologies, other pick up of them, they pick up on what others do, and that's how informatics application evolve. That's what we need in legal informatics as well. Now we have 140 registered participants. I know some are coming today, some are coming tomorrow. We have several more who sent us their mails, wanted to participate in live stream or follow on video. The videos will be made available later in the week once we get them from the TV team here at the university. So very warm welcome from my side as well. And let me sort of give you a bit of an idea what we are trying to achieve here, both with ReMeP and at the conference, because there is one thing that is very important. research meets practice means, we want to connect. The red M connects the researcher and the practitioner, this is not something that will just happen at that conference. So we have a program beyond that conference. I'll come to that later. But it's very important to me to say we are not here for just a one-off conference with a new test drive of a format. We want to really achieve one thing. Everybody in this environment, in particular lawyers, and we have about 70–80% from the legal profession as attendants, should get involved, should try things out hands-on. And we know from the practitioners that they need the feedback. They sometimes need data to do research. They need the experience of a user that applies an application. They need the feedback of what does practice need in order to get on with the research. So that's the things we want to experience. By doing that jointly, by sharing our experience, by sharing our views, we all will get on together. So we have put together a 1.5-day conference. The first half day is focused on information for which providing, so what's out there in the market, who are players, what are technologies, etc. You will hear from high-level experts from their fields of research. You will have a panel discussion with practitioners involved. We have at the end of the day a high-level discussion with a pioneer in the area, and a book presentation that rather goes towards the fintech provision, but fintech, law, regtech, all those areas are highly interconnected. So that's very important. Now, legal informatics, Ms. Opitz already mentioned, legal informatics is nothing new. It is nothing new. The applications go back to the 1950s. Yes, there are Italian, some Austrian applications already in the 1950s, applications in the 1960s and ongoing. But what's more important, the objective of lawyers to formalize the law, to have a mathematical correct decision as it was formalized many years, that goes back to the 1500s. So the idea is long out there that the law would be something mathematical. It of course does not work that way. If you're a lawyer, you will understand it relatively quickly. And those approaches to purely formalize the law did not work at the end of the day. But on the other hand, we see already now there is a lot of repetitive execution of legal processes, and why shouldn't those be formalized? Whether or not a computer gathers data and fills them in a column and then ticks the boxes, or a human being, there isn't much of a difference. Actually, the computer is more stable in its daily performance, it's probably less in error, it doesn't overlook and make other errors. So yes, we'll see a lot of applications. We'll see a disruption in law firms and in other areas of practicing law very soon, very massive, but not on the artificial intelligence level as we all think. It will be rather those tools that is the daily repetition of work. However, that affects probably 40–50% of the work in the law firm, because the lawyers in the law firm are not doing high-end legal thinking 100% of the day. It's rather, in particular, the younger staff, the support staff, that is spending most of the day in this sort of routine work. The routine work will quickly be affected very strongly. Now, that is very important for us to understand when we venture into investing in these areas. If you invest in an application today, you need to think, is it actually in that area, or is it right on the high end, very expensive, but I cannot use it often. So when you, for example, look, I don't mention the name now, but if you look at particular products that are being offered in the market, you are being asked to pay a license fee of 40–50,000 euros a year, and an annual fee of an installation fee of 40–50,000 euros, and a management fee of 25,000, and you cannot use the software without the software company. You need to upload the data to that company. You'll figure out that there are not many use cases for that, because there are not that many firms that can afford that applications on the legal side. And in the corporate departments, I think it's still also an issue that you need to find your use case to make this sort of investment. On the other hand, there's a lot of free applications. I mentioned one, Community Lawyer is a US application that's sort of a chatbot tool that helps you to put together a form document. You fill in form letters that come very cheaply, right? So look into the market and you will see immediately there are applications that will scale very quick and will be of immediate use. It's rather the mathematical statistical function, of course, at the beginning, and not the high-end AI function. One more thing, probably to the market environment. I have here one chart from Legal Geek, which in the bottom line gives us the various areas into which we categorize the market. The market at the moment is very much driven also in terms of investment and turnover by e-discovery and legal research, that far beyond 70% or so of the market. The other areas are relatively remote and very much split up in various smaller applications that cover one or the other issue. None of those products is integrated along the bottom line. They are all sort of silos in parallel. That is very important to keep in mind, because in my humble opinion, it is relatively unlikely to scale on this silo level. It needs to scale actually on the bottom line. And that is sort of where we think that things will go in the longer run. One more thing here, which gives you an overview. So there are two links. Legal Geek was one. The Tech Index of Stanford Law School lists about 1,200 companies that do legal tech applications. So if you want to look into what is out there, you might have a look at these applications. A very quick sidestep to the Austrian market, if you allow. Austria has been a very early adopter in legal tech. Also, that's probably not that much known, because it's a very early adopter in e-government, e-justice technology. IRIS, which Erich Schweighofer runs every year, is the largest informatics and law conference in Europe, with about 400 participants every year, and has a very strong focus in that market segment, where there's a lot of interest. Just if you don't know, Austrian courts are communicating with lawyers for the last, 15, 20 years by a service that's called web service, where lawyers upload their documents to the courts, and courts download their documents into a sort of mailbox to the law firms, all electronically. We had this sort of discussion, I think, in Germany half a year ago or so, where this service failed. Now in Austria it's working for many, many years. Likewise, we have the land register electronically for a similar period. The corporate register is electronically for the same sort of period. So all those services are digitalized for many, many, many years. Notarized documents get uploaded for many years in a sort of cloud service that is available to notaries, courts, and lawyers. So the market here is actually well developed on that side, and funnily, more or less not developed on the other side. So legal informatics has not arrived much at universities. You won't find postgraduates, for example, or you won't find dedicated courses in that respect, despite this very strong adoption of e-government and e-justice products. E-justice, for example, the courts are launching a service at the moment where in the courtroom all the files are made available to the participants electronically, and they are displayed on the screen on the wall. So well advanced services which we need to bring over to the private sector as well for many to participate. Now, where does this lead us? The market will evolve. We can see it if we read the newspapers for the very last 2 years. There is there is at least an awareness. I wouldn't say that there are so many applications that are really running in practice, but there is an awareness of the necessity. But we still need to figure out how does it work? How does it affect our daily lives? How do we bring those applications into our daily lives? Now, who will be the real drivers? In my opinion, corporate departments in large corporates will be the early drivers. The associations of business people will be the drivers. Why? They have the ability to scale. If all the banks say, you know, the Austrian Bankenverband, the Banking Association is, for example, such an institution, if all of they say, we adopt a certain product, they then can afford to develop the necessary tools. One tool, for example, and that's, I think, in my opinion, one of the most prominent examples of why we are in silos. One tool we all need to do this is communication. We need interfaces, right? APIs, as they are called, are necessary to get data from one application to the other. If we want to use and share data and always input the data separately in each occasion, or get the output sort of stored somewhere and need to input it separately in a new application, that will not scale, that will not be efficient. So API development will be the very first, most important issue that the market needs to address, and that will definitely not happen in law firms. That will definitely happen in corporate departments, in associations. You know, there is one example of an association that at the moment is very active in digitalizing their tools. That is ISTA, International Swap Dealer Association. If you look up Twitter or their website, you will see that there's a lot of activity around there. And this sort of associations, they have the market power, they have the market relevance in market share, that if an application is adopted and endorsed, it will scale. And if such an application is adopted and endorsed and scales and provides the necessary APIs, there will be other applications that then, based on those APIs and the scaling of such an endorsed application, will also scale. And that's how the environment, the market will evolve. And corporate environments will soon be to follow, in my opinion, in particular, and Mrs. Opp also mentioned that, compliance is easily and best achieved if you have legal tech applications in your environment. Think about a bank. A typical bank problem is that the officer in a branch office is negotiating with the customer. He has his forms, he has his instructions what to do. Sometimes he hasn't read the instructions, sometimes he hasn't probably understood them. He deviates quite often, actually, from the instruction when then doing the individual contract. When we go to court, we very often, in Austria, if you will represent a bank, you usually lose because the highest court is the opinion of that the bank customer is always right. We lose very often because of that, right? Because that an officer hasn't complied with its respective obligations. If you have processes that are monitored, and in this banking environment where you have a lot of form documents, that's actually relatively easy to achieve if you do the right legal design thinking. It's also another flash word you should keep in mind. If you do the right legal design thinking, you design the process and the various elements of it, and then of course you can check in that process, compliance-wise, whether or not the officer has done the right thing, or even better, actually the tool doesn't allow him to deviate because the tool already has the compliance implications built in, and those parts of forms that cannot be changed be changed if you implement it on a digitalized way. So where does this lead us? At the end of the day, we will see processes like this evolve on the compliance side, on this organizational association side, and they will lead the market to follow in suit. And in parallel, we will see, of course, those applications that are already out there that focus on a particular simpler process to utilize controls, documents, sort of set of documents, find a clause in an agreement, etc., etc. So there will be an involvement and a development that will kick in, I think, very soon, for the simple reason, which also Mrs. Opitz mentioned, that in the background, the research community has done a lot of work for the last 30, 40 years, and there's a lot of tools available, and now we need to learn about what is out there to understand ourselves, how will this affect our work in the future. Now, one question that is linked to that, and that's probably most important to me, when we organized that conference, we were very keen to bring in as many students as we could on free tickets, because the biggest effect on all of that will be on those people who are coming into the working environment soon. Those who have a job today in the legal environment, they will carry on to do their work. You know, this transformation process will take time. It's not happening from today to tomorrow. But if you're coming in, you'll find it harder in the future to get a place to get educated, because already, you know, firms think about, should we rather invest in technology? If we invest in technology, we probably don't invest that much in people, because technology eats up the budget and does the work. So, you know, if you bring somebody in who doesn't have work to do, you need to think about that. So the working environment will more focus on high-end qualified lawyers. So if you have a good education, a high-end qualified lawyer will always be necessary. The machine will not take over for a long time, if at all, which I don't believe. But there will be a new opportunity for those people who focus on, for example, legal design thinking, on how is a legal process digitalized, how is it monitored, how is it further developed, what do you do with the data. Many of the applications I see at the moment, or we are working on at the moment, improve, also that was mentioned, improve the quality, right? So if you have today a team of, I don't know, 10 or so people monitor a set of, let's say, 20, 30,000 lease agreements. If you support those people with technology, they will increase in quality. The output of that system will be so significant that those 10 people will need more support to actually handle the issues, right? They will find more issues to deal with than they would have had a chance to find out if that technology would not have been used and applied. So it is not automatically that those that have a job today will be affected. I actually am not a strong believer in that. But those who come in the future will have to adopt to it, and our education will have to adopt to it, and lawyers will have to understand how legal technology tools are being applied. That is one of the key issues of our conference. So tomorrow, please bring your device, bring your computer, because you do it practically. We will have 80-minute sessions where you need to do legal tech work, where you work yourself and figure out how logical decision-making works. How is an algorithm working that leads you to a decision or helps you to find something, or how an intelligent research tool works? How is it, you know, in multilingual environments or multi-jurisdictional environments? How do you analyze contracts? All those things you're going to experience. I think that's the important thing, because that is what you will have to learn in future at university. Your employer will not be able to teach you that, because your employer will buy software and then apply it, but it will not, you know, not be developer, it's the user. So you will come in and you will have to work in an environment, and that's why I address in particular the young people, the students, to think about that. Get a bit of legal education. If you're here at the Wirtschaftsuniversität Vienna, there is an informatics faculty. Right? I'm not sure whether you're allowed or not, but if you're not allowed, just drop in. Just drop in and hear about principles of programming. I tell you something, every lawyer can program, you just don't know it. Every lawyer can program. I had a lecture at Business University earlier this year with Professor Wiener for 2 days. We spent a half day on legal logic and flow charting of a legal problem. We used an environment called Flowgorithm, which is executable, flow charting. We had a homework assigned to they were master students, so of course more educated people. We had a homework assigned, and I think all the students delivered a result, a positive result. All the codes work. right? Of course, you're not programming complicated interfaces and what, but they can logically assemble and analyze a legal problem and show what the decision process is, and can transform that into a form of, let's say, chatbot that answers a question of whether or not, in our case, general terms and conditions of a contract are valid or not. Right? And Flugger written by the hand produces code in 16 different formats, so Java, JavaScript, Python, C++, whatever. Just not Prolog, unfortunately, but yeah. So it produces code. So in a way, lawyers can code. Also, that is far-fetched. I'm aware of that. So, you know, the point is, get into it. Law and logic, there's a link. There are great lectures on that. Get into a lecture of juristische Methodenlehre, the principles of law, where you read and learn about logic. If you know about law and logic, the logic leads you to the coding, right? Coding is, as also has been mentioned, an issue of zeros, ones, or, and nor, right? If you have those 5 operations, you understand the basic principles. And of course, Professor Kowalski and Professor Mattes will explain it. It's a bit more complicated, but you know, that's where you start off. That's where you start off. And Armin Cho is sitting here where I learned my basic programming, and we'll speak later. And he's an excellent teacher. So speak to him in the break, and you go away and code. So let me come towards the thing that is most important. Let me speak. So this is the idea of interaction between law and code. There's the logic in between. Let me get to the most important thing, and that is what do we expect? We will have keynotes from Professor Kowalski and Professor Mattes. I will introduce them a bit later in more detail, but Professor Kowalski is a godfather, I would say, of logic programming. When I was studying and at the university, Armin Cho taught us Prolog, logic programming, Lisp, Prolog. I mainly did Prolog. I had to do my master in Prolog, and that was always referred to as Edinburgh Prolog. And I think Professor Kowalski had a lot to do with Edinburgh Prolog and the compiler and the interpreter in developing those tools. Professor Mattes is very well known for his active research in legal informatics. He has a number of tools. He will be available tomorrow also in one of those sessions, so please take that opportunity to go to that session. And actually, the way we have structured it, you are supposed to go to that session anyway. Go to that session and hear about, digital tools, IT tools to analyze contracts. How do you get information out of a contract, and how do you deal with that sort of information? We have here, the picture is Jelena, but I'll speak, Jelena is coming, I'm speaking in the timely order, Jelena, so you're last but not least. So the next thing is actually our panel. Our panel will discuss the practical implication of law and informatics and where it's going to go in the future. Ms. Malmüller, Dr. Malmüller will moderate our panel. She is an expert long time with the Computer Association and also with in the publishing field of informatics and law. Mr. Sanz de Lama is from LexisNexis, one of the 2 large companies in Austria, and LexisNexis also internationally, of course, in legal technology, legal research. Armin Cho, I mentioned already, professor at the University of Informatics here in Vienna, and a great expert and long established and great teacher. I know from my personal experience, Mr. Harashtra is a professor from the Masaryk University in Brno on informatics, also very much involved with tools. He also had sent us a tool which we would have liked to present tomorrow, but time's not allowing, and he needs to go back to the university today, where he needs to teach tomorrow. And Professor Wiener here from the University of the Business University, from the legal faculty, who has, of course, a lot of insight in legal education in Austria and the possible application of those tools. Jonathan Eskin is then coming with a sort of interview format. I will not reveal too much about Jonathan because you need to learn that in the interview, but I can tell you that will be very interesting. And then we have Jelena Madia, who is Chief Counsel with the EBRD, the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, who is also very active in Central and Eastern Europe, supporting blockchain and other applications. Jelena has just edited a book on fintech, regtech applications. We'll speak to that at the evening reception and do a presentation on her book. And I would not like you to miss that because that will be great. And I know that because Jelena and I have worked together in the same firm for some time. Yes, and then the topics for tomorrow. The topics for tomorrow, we have a format. We have 3 sessions in the morning. You have free choice where you go. We have the Future of Document Assembly by Mr. Langthaler from the Austrian Informatics Center, who also operate most of the e-government, e-justice applications the Austrian government runs. We have an issue of secure systems. I think in particular law firms and lawyers completely underestimate the security issue. It actually is a nightmare that lawyers communicate by email and WhatsApp and I don't know what. And that corporate departments in firms do the same, or in governments, right? It is just not state of the art, and tomorrow we'll hear a bit about what the issues are. But if you speak about legal tech, it's impossible that you not think about legal IT security. This goes hand in hand. The more applications are out there, the more you need to think about how do you secure your communication, your data, and you all know there are now substantial fines in the context of GDPR, but also there's the NIS directive, which is affecting one or the other infrastructure provider. I'll do, the coding 101 actually will minimize. I'll do a very, very short slot in that session, 5 or 10 minutes. It's just, time doesn't allow it that we cover that. What we'll do is we'll do a free session of coding 101 within the next 2 or so months in a separate setup. We already are in discussions with a couple of sponsors who would like to support that, but it is in the format we are running here actually not possible. And then we have Francesco Sorvano from the University in Bologna, who will explain you algorithm decision making. He just back from Stanford, where he presented the same topic at the Codex Center, so you get something very first-hand, very interesting, one of those disruptive ideas of the future that probably will not kick in tomorrow, but they are coming in one way or the other, also to the workplace. And then we have 3 other workshops, those 3 on the bottom line, which are repeated 3 times. And we have grouped you. If you turn your pass, you'll see a color that shows you where you are attending the 3 workshops. So each of you will have the opportunity to do each of the 3 workshops here. And those 3 workshops will give you hands-on experience. We have the first workshop with Dr. Schäfbeck, Mr. Gayecker from LexisNexis, that deals with research technology on a higher level, I would say. You know, how do you get out things in research in a better, higher qualified way? How is it ranked in a better way? How you find from the results of your research a link to something that is related, important, related to that topic, but you haven't thought of. How is it working across languages, across jurisdictions? Right. The second workshop is Professor Mattes is there, and Christian Sakita, who is here. There are 2 applications. The University of Munich shows an application regarding the application of general terms and conditions, and how, you know, do you find out, for example, how they're valid or not, or what do these provisions contain. Christian Sakita is presenting Lynx. Christian Sakita is from Open Laws. I'm involved with that company. Open Laws laws is probably known to most of the Austrians here. If you have the RIS app on your handy, then you use an open laws product. There are 50,000 users, but Christian at the moment is working on researching links that is dealing with how do you get legal information on a knowledge graph, how can you abstract legal information from a contract, make it searchable, and link it, for example, to the research tools open laws is already using. And we have, most important, also a tool I had the pleasure already to experience myself, that's called NAI from the University of Luxembourg. It is about automated reasoning. Tomo Libar is here. Yes, he, together with Teresa Novotná, will give you a presentation on that. And I tell you, you need to focus and get your brain together, because that is a very tough, interesting session, but you need to be focused to follow. And you do it yourself. You will yourself do automated reasoning. You work with a text and come to a result. I'm convinced you'll enjoy that very much. And once you've done that, you know where the future is. So that is what we have in mind. Let me come to an end so that I have also time to introduce the next speaker. So we have a mission. ReMeP is not a one-off exercise. Our mission is to link research and practitioners, to build a bridge, to be an open environment, to be a basis where things are shared, where experience is shared, where your sorrows and concerns are shared, where people, show what they are working on, where others say, well, I could have an interest, a platform where code might be made available, others work on and put it back in again. What we want to do is we want to open up the community. We want to bring the community closer together. And I see already now from the feedback I have that this is well accepted. We have a couple of associations who have addressed us now in the preparation of the conference to get more involved next year, like the Association of Business Lawyers and others. And I'm happy to open up the platform for this sort of involvement. The more universities, the more associations, the more practitioners and researchers get involved, the better the exchange of information will be, the quicker we'll get on and make this an open platform. And as Mrs. Oppitz said, at the end of the day, the applications need to be affordable and available, right? If they exist in a silo in the back of a law firm's pocket, they don't get applicable. They won't scale either, so nobody will know about them. But if it should be workable, they need to be affordable and available. And I'm quite sure this is possible, because there already now is a number. And if you're interested, get in touch. There's already now a number of applications out there you could use, like Flogorithm, for example, that are freely available. All right? You can use that for training. You can use that for understanding how law and logic and coding gets together, but there are many other applications. So that's important to me. I hope it's important to you. I hope you join into that community. That's what I already said. We want to be very hands-on. That is very important, so get involved and tell us what you experience. Send us messages and information of tools. We'll get them into our platform and publish it and pass it on. And as I said, we're very open for participation. So at the very end of my presentation, I need, of course, to thank everybody who helped to put this together. Number one and most important is the Business University, Professor Kals and Professor Wiener and Ms. Oppitz, who support us, because you gave us the room, you gave us the opportunity, you gave us gave me at least the opportunity to work with a masterclass, and also that was a great experience, because that is the step forward one needs to understand how to present things and how to figure out the right thing. I need to thank the city of Vienna, who not only supported us with some money, but also does this reception tonight. So the business agency and the city together have been a great supporter. I need to thank our speakers who make their time available freely. That is great, and who share their knowledge. And of course, I need to thank our sponsors and partners, in particular also LexisNexis, who supported us significantly and also shares know-how, and all the other partners I've listed down here. So also that is a big thank you to all of that. And then last but not least, I need to thank the team of 5 people, Sabrina, Susie, Susanna, and yeah, the others. There are not that many in here. Evelyn they're all out there. But most of them you see wear their shirts. So those ladies have worked a lot over the last couple of weeks and months, honestly, to put this together. I must honestly say it was a big challenge actually to put together the workshops, because we had so many options and needed to figure out how to do this best. That took us a while. That's why we published also the workshops very, very late. I'm aware of that. We have been pretty early out there with our speakers, but pretty late with our workshops. But that was a big challenge. We learned, I think, a lot for next year, but the team was a great support on that. So with that, I end. Here's our contact information. Please get in touch. Very important to be linked up to you. Thank you very much. So without a break, I would like to move on and ask Professor Kowalski for his address. Professor Kowalski is a professor emeritus from the Imperial College in London. He studied at the University of Chicago, the University of Bridgeport. He had been at Stanford University, the University of Warsaw, and I mentioned already the University of Edinburgh. Edinburgh Prologue is always ringing back in my mind, in Edinburgh, where he finished his PD. Mr. Kowalski's research had been in automated theorem proving, leading development on logic programming. Prolog is a logic programming language, a forced level language, which is very different from other programming languages. So if you ever would like to try it, you should use a bit of time to get into it. It's not comparable to languages like Java, JavaScript, or things like that. Very interesting and very ideal to express logic expressions. Professor Kowalski wrote a book in 2011 on computational logic and human thinking. That is also sort of, I think, part of his presentation here to us, and he's very much has been involved in the issues of event calculus, legal reasoning, abductive reasoning, and argumentation. He's currently also working on similar research projects. I hope he will enlighten us on that in his presentation, and is very active in developing also programming languages that help to express this sort of intelligence. Professor Kowalski is a fellow of the Association of the Advancements of Artificial Intelligence, of the European Association for Artificial Intelligence, the Association for Computer Machinery. That's one thing I wanted to mention during my presentation, probably I added here. We are not a scientific conference, but we have speakers with a high-level scientific background. Right? We have speakers with a high-level scientific background who are able to explain scientific things for ordinary people. That is why I have invited Professor Kowalski, and very much looking forward to his presentation, and also Professor Mattes, because I think we'll all learn a lot today. Yeah, Peter. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Stefan, and both for that very nice introduction and also for inviting me to be here today.
My pleasure.
Well, my revised title is about logical English, which is inspired by legal language but executable by computer. This is very much work in progress, so you don't yet have a final presentation here today. I hope to come back and give you more inspiring talk in the future. This work, of course, has not been done alone. It's been done with a number of colleagues, and I want to mention them right at the beginning, but also again at the end. Let me start at the end of my talk. In 1993, I wrote a paper called Legislation as Logic Programs, and this paper was widely reported in the press, including the Times newspaper. And in one of the press reports of my paper, it was said that the future of computing lies not with programmers, but with lawyers. Unfortunately, this did not make me very good friends with my computer science colleagues, nor with the mathematicians who share the same building with us. But I want to return to that idea, which I argued about how many years ago? 25 years ago, because I think we've made some progress to prove my point during that time. So what is logical English? Of course, it could be logical German, it could be logical Polish. But in any case, it's modeled on the language of law, but it can be executed by a computer. It can be understood by English speakers without any training in computing, indeed without any training in logic. It can just be understood by understanding natural language alone. I believe that one day it'll be suitable for general purpose computation, replacing the programming languages that we have today, replacing the database languages that we have today, and knowledge representation languages that are being used in artificial intelligence. We have several prototypes in the programming language Prolog, but there's still some way to go. Let's compare the language of law, which is the inspiration for logical English, with the majority of computer languages that we have today. First of all, law is declarative. You can talk about whether a sentence is true or false. But the majority of programming languages are imperative. They issue commands to a computer, telling a computer what it should do. And typically what the computer should do is change what is inside the memory locations of the computer. In order to program in the majority of computer languages today, you have to think like a computer. In the language of law, we describe the legal consequences of actions and events. If a party performs an action, then the law or a legal document, whether it's a contract or a piece of legislation, tells us what the legal consequences are of those events, how the state of the world changes in response to changes in the world. But in the majority of computer languages, we control memory locations in a computer. This has nothing to do with the way humans think. And in order to program in the majority of computer languages, you have to think like a computer. In the language of law, we use logical expressions. We use expressions which are logical conditions. If certain conditions hold, then certain conclusions will hold as a consequence. We talk about all parties to a contract. We talk about all people who are born in the United Kingdom and whether or not they will be citizens of the United Kingdom. So we have logical expressions in the language of law, but in computer languages, we have if-then-else statements. If-then-else statements which are not found in the language of law or in ordinary natural languages. We have iterations and we have loops. Yes, you can learn to code, you can learn to think like a computer, but why do that if computers can be made to think like us? In the language of law, we attempt to avoid ambiguity. We attempt to express ourselves in a meaningful way, which means the same thing for you as it does for me. We allow vagueness or open texture so that we can be flexible about the definition of terms which might not be well understood, which might vary from time to time and from context to context. But of course, computer languages are unambiguous by design. And indeed, there's nothing wrong with indeed, it is highly desirable that computers be programmed in an unambiguous fashion. But one of the reasons why the language of law is declaratively is because it passes passive judgment on states of affairs and behavior of agents. The law is not an actor. The law is a judge that passes judgment on the behavior of external agents. On the other hand, computer languages are active agents. They act on behalf of clients, stakeholders, but as a result of acting on behalf of them, they perform actions, which is not the case in the language of law, and they also are given commands, which is why these languages are typically imperative. Now, the two worlds, the world of the language of law and the world of computer languages, come together in the area of smart contracts executed on blockchains. So this application area is a kind of killer application for any language which is designed to be based on the law. And what do we find with smart contracts? That they, unlike the language of law, actively support the goals of the stakeholders to legal agreements, and therefore they do perform actions. They transfer funds. They may send notifications of transfer of funds. They may send warnings and other notices. So the field of smart contracts gives us an opportunity to see how the two worlds of law and computing come together. In my talk, I will illustrate logical English with 4 examples. The first example historically is interesting and indeed important because it was done, I think, about 35 years ago, and it had a major impact at the time. The second example is quite a recent example. Let me first make a little bit more detail. So the first example of the British Nationality Act showed how logic programs are close to the language of well-written legislation. The second example, a very recently investigated example, has been used by legal scholars in order to argue that deterministic finite automata from the world of computing are a better way to think about legal contracts than either logic or the language of law. And I want to disagree. So I will look at the example and show you how we can do better than deterministic finite automata by expressing the simplified loan agreement in logical English. The third example comes from lessons in a cryptocurrency lab at the University of Maryland, and it's a good example of a smart contract which actively transfers funds in a game, transferring funds either to the winner of a game or distributing them back to the original players if there's a draw. Because it's active, it's written in an imperative language, the language Serpent, which is a variant of Python, and it's a conventional computer language. I want to investigate to what extent the use of imperatives is important in that application, and what does it mean for logical English? Do imperatives have a logic? And if so, what is that logic? And finally, the last example that we've been looking at over the summer is the International Swaps and Derivatives Association Master Agreement. And there we have a case of very complex obligations, with one obligation overriding another obligation, replacing it in certain circumstances. And again, I'll want to look, in this case, how logical English can represent complex obligations. Well, to go back then, or to the beginning of much of our work, at least, in logical English, let me show you the first clause of the British Nationality Act, written in the original English. So in the original English, we have a sentence which says that a person born in the United Kingdom after commencement, that is to say the date on which the Act takes effect, shall be a British citizen if at the time of the birth his or her father or mother is a British citizen or settled in the United Kingdom. Now, is this English or is it logic? And to what extent does it deviate from conventional, more symbolic or more traditional logic? Well, it deviates primarily in this phrase, born in the United Kingdom, because although the sentence has conclusion if conditions form, the conclusion has embedded inside of it two conditions. So when we rewrite this in a more logical, more transparent manner, we separate out the conclusion, namely that a person acquires British citizenship, and are more precise and say, in fact, that they acquire their citizenship by means of this particular section, because a person can be a British citizen according to other sections of the Act, for example, through naturalization or through registration. And if you acquire your citizenship by some other means, you may not have the same quality of citizenship as you would have if you acquired it in this manner. So in logical English, we clearly separate out conclusions from conditions. Embedded in the original English was the condition that the person is born in the United Kingdom at a particular time, and that time is after commencement. And of course we have the other conditions, which are logically at the same level. There's no logical distinction between where you are born, when you are born, and who your parents are. So the other conditions are that there be another person who is either the father or the mother of the person, and that the other person be a British citizen at the same time or be settled in the United Kingdom at that same time. Now this is a rather stultified form of English, so let me go back to the original claim. Oops, it's taking a bit of a while. I've probably made a mistake in doing this. So, read what's inside this red circle. We don't claim that logical English is the most natural English, but we do claim it can be read. It can be read and it can be understood by human beings, and it can also be read and understood by computers. Now notice also one of the ways in which we represent the logic is we have logical variables. These are not the same as variables in the imperative computer language sense. They're not values that change over time. So a variable in an imperative programming language is some location inside the computer whose contents changes over time. But a logical variable is a term which can be instantiated in various different ways. So a person can be you, it can be me, it could be John, it could be Mary. And the first time we refer to this variable, we represent that variable by the indefinite determiner an, or another. So here you see, oops, I knew it. So this is the first occurrence of the variable. This is the second occurrence, fourth and fifth occurrence. It's the same variable, x, called it x. And then, so the first occurrence is prefixed by the indefinite article. It's indefinite, which individual you're talking about, and then the later occurrences are prefixed by the definite article because it is definitely the case you know who that individual is. These variables, these logical variables, are typed. So there is an X of type person, and that person acquires British citizenship under certain conditions. Notice that this logical English is not like Aristotle's logical syllogisms. There are no all, every, or some. And that's because it's simpler to just say and the. So let's look at, for example, at a typical sentence that might be logical, of course, but nonetheless use terms which are more familiarly logical. All payments that are specified in some transaction are obligatory. Here you have all, here you have some. These occur in ordinary language, they occur in ordinary logic, but they are unnecessary. It is possible to replace them by a and the. Moreover, this phrase that are specified is a conclusion rather than it is part of the conditions rather than the conclusions. So what we would do is rewrite this. For example, this is only one way we could write this. We would rewrite this by saying a payment. This is a logical variable. First time that it's referred to, it's an indefinite common noun. A payment is obligatory if the payment, second time we refer to it, is specified in a transaction. You could replace these by x's and y's. X is obligatory if x is specified in a y, and x is a payment and y is a transaction, because these are type variables. So we can take this form of English and transform it into a lower layer, which is very close to the prologue layer, as it turns out in our prototypes. But that's not the only way we could represent this sentence. So although we have a language called, or are working towards a language of logical English, we also need to work towards a style of writing in this logical English language. And there's another way of writing the same sentence with the same meaning. We could say it is an obligation that a payment is made if the payment is specified in a transaction. And this particular way of representing that sentence, instead of being obligatory as a predicate, having obligation as a type of entity, gives us far more expressive power and allows us to talk about obligations. It allows us to say that one obligation might override another obligation. It allows us to say what are the conditions under which an obligation might be satisfied. When is an obligation breached? None of this is so easy if we adopt the first style. If we simply say that a payment is obligatory, it makes it harder to say that this obligation has been breached or that the obligation has been satisfied. So we have the beginnings of a language called logical English, but we are still struggling somewhat with the style which is most appropriate for representing knowledge in that language. Ideally, and hopefully, this language is expressive enough not only for representing the information in legal documents, but also for more general information that we might want to use to describe the world in which we live. So that was my first example. Let me see how we do for time. My second example is, in a sense, a counterexample, or so the authors of this paper might argue. The second author, Oliver Goodenough in particular, is a legal scholar who says English is not that great for thinking about law. English is not that useful for understanding law. And a much more useful way of thinking about law is to use the notions of deterministic finite automata that come from the world of computer science. And he and his co-author look at this rather nice simplified loan agreement, which talks about a loan being given from a lender to a borrower, and the borrower needing to repay the loan in 2 installments over the course of 2 years. And much of the loan is taken up with not so much describing the green path where everything goes as planned and goes as hoped for, but most of the loan agreement is taken up with describing what happens when things go wrong. What happens, for example, if the borrower does not pay those installments? And how long does the borrower have to remedy or cure the default that would arise if that payment is not made? And then what happens if the cure does not take place? The authors show a finite automa, and this is what it looks like. It's a pretty picture. It looks like a flow chart of sorts, and it certainly makes it puts a smile on a computer scientist's face because it makes them feel indispensable. So let's look in detail at a very simple sentence. This simple sentence corresponds to this path, where the lender does or does not advance. The first part is where the borrower asks for right up here. The borrower, is that right? Can you read this? No. The borrower requests a loan. That's the first path, and then and if the borrower does not does not request the loan, then everything is terminated. And then the next question is whether the lender advances the loan. If the lender advances the loan, then everything is on the green path and going according to plan. But suppose the lender does not advance the loan. So let's look what the English says. The first sentence, number 1, says, at the request of the borrower to be given on the 1st of June 2014, you can see when this paper was written, therefore, the lender will advance $1,000 to the borrower no later than the 2nd of June. If the borrower does not make such a request, this agreement will terminate. So the authors of this paper claim that this English is not very helpful. They claim if you want to automate the law, if you want to have legal informatics, it's better to translate into deterministic finite automata. And notice, by the way, these two English words, will. The lender will advance the $1,000. The agreement will terminate. Now, the English language uses this word will twice, but does it use them in the same sense? Does it use them in the same sense? No, it does not use them in the same sense. The first will represents an obligation of the lender, and if the lender does not advance the $1,000, then the lender is in trouble. On the other hand, if this agreement will not terminate, then nobody gets, there's no avoiding the agreement. It will do nothing else. There's only one way forward. So this is more of an action. This is that takes place terminating the contract. So let's look at a representation in logical executable English. It is an obligation. I'm looking now at the first sentence. It is an obligation that the lender advances $1,000 to the borrower at a time, and the time is before the end of the 2nd of June 2014, if the borrower has requested that $1,000 on the previous day, the 1st of June 2014. So the first sentence represents an obligation, whereas the second sentence does not. On the other hand, the first sentence can be written, as I've suggested before, in a number of different ways. The first sentence can also be written in the style, and now this is the style of the deterministic finite automata. So although the language is logical English, the language can simulate deontic modal logic, or the language can simulate deterministic finite automata. So the language, like ordinary English, allows many different styles of representation, many different styles of expression. So the second representation is in the style of finite deterministic automata. The lender becomes liable to litigation, which is implicit in the obligation for the lender to advance the funds if it is the end of 2014, the 2nd of June. and the borrower has requested $1,000, and it is not the case that the lender has advanced the loan. So the obligation gets twisted. It only gets represented in terms of what happens if the obligation is breached. So the first sentence represents the obligation straightforwardly, and it doesn't draw any conclusions about what happens should there be a breach. Whereas the second representation builds into the representation that failure to advance the loan constitutes a breach, but not saying that explicitly, rather saying, in fact, that if it should occur that the lender does not advance the loan, then the lender is liable to litigation. This is a way of treating deontic concepts and obligations implicitly rather than explicitly. And the co-author, Oliver Goodenough, has written extensively against deontic logic, saying that we can avoid deontic logic and avoid talking about obligations by talking instead about state transitions. Now, I'm not going to argue with that, because in fact, when I read the paper, I was quite convinced that that ontology, that way of thinking about things, was actually quite useful. And I implemented their loan agreement in a lower level, prologue-like language, using this way of avoiding explicit obligations. Look instead now at the second sentence. If the borrower does not make such a request, this agreement will terminate. No obligation here. The contract will become terminated at a time if it is the end of the 1st of June 2014 at the time, and it is not the case that the borrower has requested the loan at the time. Now, you may not like this, and I can see why from the looks on your faces. You don't like this explicit representation, a time, the time. In ordinary language, we don't talk this way. We don't speak this way. And that's because we have easier, simpler ways of talking about time. We could instead say the contract becomes terminated when it is the end of the 1st of June 2014, and it is not the case that the borrower has requested the loan. Now, the question is this precise? Is this logical? Is this as rigorous as the sentence I first showed you? And the answer to that question is yes. And there is a transformation in the sense of Chomsky's transformational grammars that allows you to take a sentence of the form, some conclusion holds when some conditions hold, and translate that into a more precise statement about a conclusion holding at a time if the conditions hold at the same time. So we can imagine the hierarchy of logical English statements. The lower representations are closer to the implementation, in a sense closer to the actual meaning, whereas the higher level representation, this one up here, is closer to ordinary English. So you start with ordinary English, remove passive, translate passives into active voice, as in Chomsky's grammars, remove the word when by introducing explicit references to time, and we can go further and take this one or several levels deeper and translating it into symbolic, logical, executable notation. The notation you see here is a higher level than prologue called logical production system, which involves sentences of this logic programming conclusion if conditions form, but also other kinds of sentences I'm going to show you in my next example from the cryptocurrency field. So this particular example has been implemented in LPS, Logical Production System Language. It runs online, and this is an extract from that program. It's an extract that doesn't use explicit time already. And I can give it a sequence of imaginary external observations about the borrower requesting the loan at 3 o'clock on the 1st of June, 2014. The lender advancing the loan at 6 p.m. on the 2nd of June, the borrower paying the lender back $550, that's to say half of the loan plus 5% interest 1 year later, and then finishing by paying another 5% and the principal another year later. And we can automatically generate the state transition graph from the logic in this particular implementation. So I'm not arguing by any means that definite deterministic finite automata are not a good way of thinking or visualizing state transitions in the real or imaginary world, but rather there's no need to get rid of English or natural language, and in particular no need to get rid of logic in particular. I have 2 more examples. I think I would probably skip this example because I want to spend more time on the last example, but I'll flash through it. Close your eyes if it's too blinding in the process. So there is this widely cited paper, 259 citations for a paper written in 2016 is quite a large number. And they talk about the rock, paper, scissors game. I've been told everybody knows this game, although I didn't at the time. And here is an attempt in our Swish implementation, an early version of logical English, which represents the game. And here is the underlying prologue-like implementation, but I want to draw your attention to these 2 sentences here, which describe the game. In particular, if I look at this rule is not a logic programming prologue-like rule. It's a rule that has an imperative interpretation. So logical English is intended to close the gap between declarative and imperative sentences, and it's intended to have the same expressive power as imperative programming languages. So in symbolic notation, and if you read this imperatively, the sentence says that if a player has played a choice, rock, paper, or scissors, and another player has played another choice, rock, paper, scissors, and the choice, namely the first one, beats the other choice, namely the second one, and the game is not over yet, and the reward is a prize, then end the game and pay the player the prize. You have to end the game because you don't want 3 people playing at once. And that's why one of the conditions is that the game is not over, and one of the conclusions is that make the game over so that you lock the system so that you don't get the problems that were identified in the cryptocurrency world. So now why is this using imperative language? It's using imperative language because the computer is being used as an agent. The computer is not only passively judging states of affairs, but it's actively involved. It is stopping the game to prevent interference between too many players, and it's also paying out, transferring funds from one player, from the system itself to the other player. But this could also be stated declaratively. Instead of stating the conclusion, then end the game and pay the player, it could be stated as in a purely declarative, legal-like manner by saying, then the game becomes over, the game is finished, and the player is paid the price. So what does this mean? Well, go back to 1958 to the philosopher Peter Geach. The logic of imperatives, he says, is, I think, fairly trivial, and I would agree with him. For every proper imperative, and for every imperative programming language, there is a future tense statement whose coming true is identical with the fulfillment of the imperative. This is the source of everything that can be said about the inferability and compatibility of imperatives. There being imperatives does not affect these logical interrelations. That was stated, how many years? 60 years or so ago, and there's still some merit in reading old papers. Well, I want to now look at my last example. And as I said, this had a master's degree student working on this over the summer. So this is the International Swaps and Derivatives Association Master Agreement. Stefan knows far more about it than I do, but I've been looking at the logic and at the English, and I've been having problems. So first of all, the master agreement is meant to be a standard agreement which is not altered. Every over-the-counter trade is supposed to conform to the master agreement. However, you can override certain clauses by a schedule, and then you have various confirmations that involve individual transactions. This is my master's degree student who just finished and who is working for the Bank of England. I'm hoping that he'll come back to this application in the near future. Well, here's a very simple, I'll start simply. Each party, there are two parties, the party and the counterparty, will make each payment or delivery specified in each confirmation to be made by it subject to the other provisions of this agreement. Notice will, this is an obligation. Each is like all or some, so we have to replace that by a. So it is an obligation that a party performs an action if the action is specified in a confirmation and the action is a payment or the action is a delivery. So this is quite simple, you might say, so far. Quite simple, quite straightforward. And notice that the indefinite article or an and the definite article the allow us to avoid all, some, each, and every, all of those sentences in English which have a logical interpretation. But what about this subject to the other provisions of this agreement? What does that mean? Well, the other provisions are the ones, for example, in the schedule and elsewhere in the master agreement. And what they do is they allow the conclusion not to hold if certain conditions hold. In particular, the conclusion will hold if it cannot be shown that it is not the case that the obligation holds. So this is like saying a bird can fly if it is not the case that the bird cannot fly. So you have maybe an argument that says the bird can fly. You have another argument that says the bird cannot fly, but the second argument trumps the first. So from an argumentation theoretic perspective, we can view this as one argument rebutting the other. We can say, what does it mean for an obligation to be satisfied? Which is why it's better to represent this as saying it is an obligation, just like saying it is a bird. So by reifying, we call this reification and nominalization, by reifying obligations and making them individuals, we can talk about them and talk about whether they're satisfied, an obligation is satisfied. If the obligation is that the party performs an action, this is not only reification, but it's either higher order logic, second order logic, or meta logic, depending on your point of view, and the party performs the action. And an obligation is violated or breached if it is not the case that the obligation is satisfied. These act like the axioms of a modal deontic logic, but they're executable in prologue. So you need to have ways of reasoning and thinking about obligations, but you don't need to go to the complexities of deontic logic to do so. Well, this is the interesting clause I want to draw your attention to: netting of payments. If on any date amounts that would otherwise be payable in the same currency, pounds, euros, what have you, and in respect of the same transaction. So there's one transaction, but there might be certain amounts, payments, all due on the same day in the same currency by each party to the other. Again, the each and the other. Then on that date, so you're talking about fixing a date, fixing a currency, and fixing a transaction. On that date, each party's obligation to make the payment will be automatically satisfied and discharged, and if the aggregate amount which would otherwise have been payable by one party exceeds the aggregate amount that would otherwise have been payable by the other party, replaced. Will be replaced. So the original obligation, each party's obligation will be replaced by an obligation upon the party by which the larger aggregate amount would have been payable to pay to the other party the excess of the larger aggregate amount over the smaller aggregate amount. Now, so I'm not complaining about the complexity of the English. I'm complaining about I'm complaining about the complexity of the logic, and in fact that the logic is incorrect. The logic does not say what most people read it as saying. Most people, if you search the internet for netting of payments in the interpret this incorrectly to mean it is optional whether or not you net payments. But here it clearly says it's not optional. You're under an obligation. Anyway, that obligation becomes far clearer both to humans and machines if we rewrite this in the logical English I've been describing. So, this is an exception to the obligation rule. It is not the case. So remember the previous sentence says that it is an obligation for each party to make the payment specified in each confirmation. But this earlier obligation replaces the old obligation and therefore prevents the old obligation from being applied. It is not the case that it is an obligation that a party pays to a counterparty an amount in a currency for a transaction if it is obligatory that the party pays a net amount. So here I'm distinguishing between a bird and a flying bird. So we have we have a variable, a logical variable of type amount, and we have another logical variable of type net amount. These are different types. So if there's an obligation to pay a net amount, then this cancels the obligation to pay the ordinary amount. And there is an obligation to pay a net amount if the net amount is a larger aggregate amount minus a smaller aggregate amount. The larger aggregate amount is the sum of each amount of each payment. Now here I have used the word each. I've needed, I can't just say because there would be an ambiguity. Of each amount of each payment by the party to the counterparty in the currency for the transaction on the date. And the smaller amount is the sum of the amount of each payment by the counterparty to the party in the currency for the transaction on the date. For those of you who know Prolog, this sum of translates directly into one of Prolog's aggregate operators, so it translates quite simply into Prolog. And I claim that this is executable by machine, more easily read and understood and more correctly read than the original English. So logical English is not only English, but it's possibly easier to understand than ordinary English. Well, I wrote a paper more than 25 years ago where I argued, like I argue today, that the linguistic style in which legislation is normally written has many similarities with the language of logic programming, and this was picked up by the British press. And the good news is that programmers will someday go away and be replaced by lawyers, so there's going to be plenty of opportunities for the legal profession. And if you want more information and more opinionation, you can go to my webpage, you can look at my book, you can look at the language LPS, the startup company, Logical Contracts, and my master's degree student, and I want to thank my colleagues. And I want to thank you.
Okay. I've never promised you it's simple if you're a lawyer, but you see, there's a future for lawyers when they start to code once the computer specialists have gone away. Well, let's see that. But what Robert made very clear is, why does a lawyer need to understand the logic and the language of its language in order to get to an executable version? And the other way around, if somebody does provide a computable program on legal language, why do you need to understand how that works? Because otherwise you won't be able to follow what's happening. Now, our second keynote is by Professor Florian Mattes from the Technical University of Munich. Professor Mattes holds the chair of the software engineering for business information systems at Technische University Munich since 2002. His current focus is research on technologies driving the digital transformation of enterprises and societies, enterprise architecture, management, service platform, and the ecosystem semantic analysis of legal texts and executable contracts on blockchains. He's a co-founder and chairman of the board of the Core Media and InfoAsset, co-founder of many other activities, and in particular a member of the Munich Kreis, as a scientific advisor of Numania Digital, member of the advisory board of the Ernst Dennett Stiftung for Software Engineering, coordinator of the Blockchain TU München Research Cluster, and initiator and organizer of international conferences and workshops in software and enterprise engineering. Already before that, Professor Mattes had a long-standing career at Goethe University in Frankfurt, the University of Hamburg, and many other research institutes. Welcome with me, Professor Mattes, to give us his lightning talk, and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you.
Yes, Stefan invited me to this new series of events on bringing together practice and research in legal informatics or legal tech, however you want to call it. And so therefore I decided not to talk about my research, but more or less give a spontaneous or not a dedicated talk on this business ecosystem perspective of legal informatics services. So therefore, the idea is more or less, I want to report on my, well, not report. So based on my past experience in other disciplines, bringing together research of the university into practice, I want to share some ideas. Maybe they are wrong. What I think may be important to have legal informatics services at scale. And not only looking at individual players, what they are doing, let's say service providers, what service they use and which they provide, but looking at the ecosystem of these different players and how they interact, and then trying to find out where the money goes, yeah, because in the end, if you want to found a company, you don't want to write papers, so you have to have customers which pay you, so therefore you should see where the market of legal services develops, and once you know how this market develops, it may be easier for you to develop information or informatics services for these players. Okay, so the background, I don't do this, there's a lot of words what we are talking about. I started in the area of legal tech in German and natural language processing 6 years ago. Before I did a lot of work in social software engineering, service platform and ecosystems, and enterprise architecture management. And so therefore my perspective is more now from the perspective of service platform and ecosystems, where we did research and practical projects, and also social software engineering, where we developed platforms and we created spin-off companies and sold them and did this again. So therefore that's a more business-oriented perspective on the whole thing. So what are these business ecosystems, so term I'm using? So essentially it's the idea that if you have a classical value chain across organizations, maybe you are the company, and then you have suppliers, you buy some products, you create some value, and then you sell the product or distribute them, and you sell them to customers, and then you create more or less a value chain, more or less left to right. If you look at more modern markets, we see that you not only look at your direct supply chain and your delivery pipeline, let's say the distributors and the distributors' consumers, but you also look at regulators in this area, you look at innovators in this area. In particular, if you use digital technologies, let's say you not only build cars, but you want to make smart cars which can drive autonomously, then you need also to look at IT services and business models which are beyond your immediate suppliers and distributors. And therefore nowadays everybody is talking about the business ecosystem, which describes the holistic environment of a company, covering current and potential future business partners. Today maybe Google and BMW don't have so much in common, but maybe in the future Google and BMW have many conflicts and interactions. So therefore you look at the current state of affairs and the future where the ball is flowing as business partners, customers, suppliers, competitors, regulatory institutions. In particular, if we talk about the law, this is regulated, and therefore the law, legal institutions are important, and also innovative startups. The important point about the ecosystem is that it's rather similar to what you see in nature. It has a certain set of players which are rather static, but then you have a continuous entry of new relationships between this partner, which leads to an evolution of this ecosystem. And then you have something like keystone players or niche players in this ecosystem, which is rather intuitively understandable. And what we see is now in this turbulent environment, also in the legal market, we want to understand how is the ecosystem of legal services evolving. What's the current state? What are mega trends? What are evolutions? And then once we understood this, we can better understand where to put informatics or informatics-based legal services. The idea is older than the buzzword. The seminal book is by James Moore from 1990, where he more or less defined the collection of interacting companies in the interaction and the changing interaction over time. These are more modern slides which come from the usual suspects, McKinsey and Company, which more or less make simple slides about complicated facts, and they more or less draw more or less the world of money. So where you have more or less B2 business to customer services, where you're facing individuals, me as a customer, how do I travel, how do I move around the city, how do I get educated, how do I live, how do I consume digital content, how do I care for my health, what are my public services I'm using. So that's, or clothing. So that's more or less people's needs, and what is shown here visually is that these markets, which have been segmented, like mobility, was rather separated from traveling, so they are starting to overlap. The same thing happens if you go to the institutional level, B2B business. Then you have B2B marketplaces, B2B services, where you have in particular also legal services here. You have transports, logistic chains. So again, there's this below the line B2B business. And if you look at ecosystems, they are somehow interacting, and you get more and more interactions, in particular through digital services and digital dependencies and data and knowledge and software. We have been hit by this phenomenon in the past in our research, in our spin-off activities, looking at the urban mobility ecosystem in Munich, for example. Yeah, people, like in Vienna, you now have a lot of more mobility options, and it's all about car sharing, ride sharing, trip sharing, ad hoc mobility services, where you more or less are mostly interested if you open up Google, and Google tells you how to get from the airport to this location. Yeah, and Google can show you either your train, it can show you a car, or it can show you a bike, yeah, which you could take. Yeah, so therefore the visibility, so the choice whether you go by train to the city or you take a taxi or you take Uber is very much influenced by the information you get about the service you can have. Yeah? So therefore, if you want to understand whether your scooter will be used in the city, it's very important to know who controls the findability of your scooters. And that's obviously Google and Apple, which more or less influence the way you can consume these services. We are currently also looking at the blockchain ecosystem. What are the players in the blockchain ecosystem? Who's using it? Who's producing blockchain solutions? And what are the interdependencies? I was invited 1 year ago to give a keynote speech for the Patent Office Association in Germany about legal tech opportunities for the patent office services. So therefore I will point to this in my talk briefly. We are doing currently a document generation tool survey to create transparency. What are these document generation tools available on the market? Who's using them? How is this market separated? Yeah, so these are tiny steps of understanding the ecosystem. And today I only will give you a rough overview of large trends to more or less make you think about the ecosystem and where legal informatics systems might fit in. The other projects we are doing in the robotic retail system, you know, Amazon is now entering also the retail. If you go to a shop, that Amazon is not only online, but they also have robotic shops, and therefore there's a research project in Germany to understand what should the big things like Aldi and the shops do now in Germany to counter this retail of robotic shops. Okay, so that's maybe our background, personal background, on why I think this topic might be relevant also for the legal business ecosystem, that we have this ecosystem perspective. Yeah, not looking at my company and my legal tech company, but looking at the whole ecosystem. Where does it move, and where do I want to fit into this ecosystem? So therefore, we will start off with the current legal service ecosystem. Again, a very rough sketch. Then having a look at legal informatics services or legal tech. Maybe it's the same. I will show a little bit the differences. And then have a glimpse at the future. And again, if I'm talking of the future, nobody knows the future, how it should look like. And then I talk what we are doing based on this ecosystem perspective, and maybe why such events like we are here, which bring together practitioners and researchers, how they should collaborate based on these learnings of this business ecosystem perspective. So I stole these pictures, so I was lazy. Yeah, I go to Google and I said, okay, what's legal service ecosystem? And luckily there are some slides which are not very nice looking, which more or less depict a perspective which is not from me. So therefore, essentially, if you want to understand the legal ecosystem today, you have legal service providers, the green ones, you have customers, and the customers can be separated in corporate legal departments. You have very large corporates like BMW, Siemens, I don't know. You have small and medium-sized companies, and you have small companies or individual persons in small companies. Then you have governments, notaries, patent offices, etc., which need legal advice, and then you have individuals. Yeah? So these are the three consumers or customers that want to have legal services. Who's providing these services? It's classical law firms. Again, you have large, medium, small law firms which have different organizations. Then you have the big four, PwC, Ernst & Young, KPMG, and Deloitte, which more or less have a lot of capital, which are not run by people, but which are more or less big organizations, which more or less have a lot of money. Then we have the small breed of legal tech companies, which provide services to some of them, and also directly to some of these customers, like Flight Rights directly addresses individual customers. And then you have outsourcing partners like legal service providers, which also consume legal tech services. The whole thing is influenced by regulators and enforcers. And also you have investors, which more or less are happy to invest now. There's a lot of money floating around on the planet which wants to be invested into companies. And then the question is this an attractive market where somebody wants to invest in? Or is this an interesting market where I would recommend my PhD students to found a company? Yeah, that's the main question. Is it a good market, or should we go to other markets where AI and blockchain have better opportunities to make money? So this is more or less a very rough sketch, yeah? But it should show you what could an ecosystem look like, and what we would do now is we would break it down. Yeah, here we have 4 players, and we would have to look more closely in these sectors. If I talk about, when I talked last year with the patent service providers, yeah, you know, where you have filed patents, then you would see that it is rather different from the ordinary legal services, yeah, because there you have a pure B2B business. It's only for businesses, patent. You have a long history of international corporations, which is not so much the case if you talk about German law and lawyers and international lawyers. This is separated. They don't collaborate historically on a planetary scale, as Microsoft would call it. You have very influential central actors like the patent patent organizations. Again, the partners themselves are have a high IT affinity. They have engineering background. They've standardized data structures and processes, and they also have an early start on digitalization of registered directories and procedures at patent offices. Yeah, and if you compare this with current non-patent offices, legal firms, this is not the case. Many of these things are not true. They are still lagging behind very much, in particular in Germany. We heard about Austria, where we have a lot of digitalization already in the legal system, but if you look to Germany, it's still a lot of paper-based work. Yeah? So therefore the question, how easy is it to sell IT solutions to this kind of people, is difficult. Yeah? So therefore, already also in the patent area, you have owner-operated law firms which don't have very much capital. Yeah? So if they are now 50 years old or 60 years old, so they say, I don't start a digital initiative or legal tech initiative because I'm dead when this will produce money. So therefore, typically, again, institutions like the European Patent Organization would invest into IT solutions from IBM or Watson or whatever. Again, the market, as also Stefan explained, is highly fragmented. You have from regional technical areas, and also it's very difficult if you have a process support in your law firm, and then you want to add AI solutions or legal tech solutions to the established processes, business process in this law firm. It's rather difficult. This was what all the patent office owners told me. They would like to change it, but since the platform is not SAP or it's not standardized, everybody has a small ad hoc solution. It's very hard to integrate smart IT solutions into this world. Okay, so then I asked them about the future, and we want to talk about the future. Also here, in the patent area, they said, okay, this complete digitalization of documents and document communication will happen. There are still some bottlenecks, but they also see that the cloud and software as a service cloud services will be the future, that you don't have to purchase software, but you rent software. They also will see there will be a political pressure to improve access to justice, and they also see issues that more and more tasks will be offloaded to the customer. Yeah, so that you don't have to do the office won't do it, but you as a customer have to more or less actively enter data, structure your information, and provide your data yourself. And in general, there's this idea of price erosion for digitized products and services, so that you want to have fixed price patent support and not have negotiation, how much this might cost in the future, and the prices will go down. So that was their expectation as experts, and I should simply reflect it because I don't have an opinion about this future. So if you now look at legal information services, yeah, this is what we are talking about. We're not talking about the legal market, but you want to now find niches or even bigger parts of this market where legal informatics services are needed, yeah, which can be practically generate benefits. So therefore, we now look at these legal tech. Yeah, you all know it. It's innovative legal services which are made possible by advanced information communication technologies. And depending, if you're an academic, you would always look at the advanced information communication services, knowledge management, semantic representation, semantic search, deep machine learning. Whereas some people, if you talk information communication technology, they say, yeah, if you have a directory of lawyers, this is already an IT service, yeah? And therefore you would have a very different definition what is legal tech if you go to the books or to the online platforms and if you go to the legal tech conferences. So here, this is an example, legal tech in Germany, a lot of icons. We saw also in your presentation a lot of icons. And these are tiny companies which more or less provide very limited functionality at a small scale. Yeah? So therefore, and here you can also sort this. So here the source is given here. And there's some clustering, more or less, what services do they provide. And I don't want to go into the details here, but it should clearly say that what we are researching is a tiny amount of this what's going on here. Yeah, and the most profitable business in this area do very stupid or very simple process-based stuff, which is not bad, but we have to be careful. Yeah, so that we say, what do people want to buy? Who's willing to pay for a service? How much are you willing to pay? Is it a large amount of small individuals which pay little? Then you can have a profitable business, or is it some very large companies with big problems which have big money? Yeah, and so therefore the companies I founded sooner or later left the area of patent offices and legal firms and moved on to e-commerce and to mobility systems and financial markets because there's the market. They have similar problems where the same technology helps, but they more or less are easier as customers. Yeah? And if you start a company, that's important for you. So here's a long list of things people are doing, but what we are looking is mostly these research prototypes at universities and colleges, which more or less do more sophisticated stuff and not only listings of lawyers and directories of lawyers or visualization of legal documents, etc. What's also interesting, I think, which has an influence is this, we are at the university and I'm also a university teacher, is the legal tech education. Yeah? So who is creating the workforce for the future? People which are interested in more or less listening to talks from Robert Kowalski or me about these complicated things. Yeah? And again, if the students don't see a future and a market future for these tools, they're also not willing more or less to really understand what is deontic logic. Why is it important for me? Yeah? If you don't want to write a smart contract language, maybe you don't need to know these differences here. And so therefore, I think now there's a lot of hype now around this cognitive computing, in particular thanks to IBM and Watson, which more or less has all these TV spots where they talk about all these lawyers and Ross, where they more or less claim that there's a company, it's called Ross, which does very smart things for lawyers without any need to program and to develop stuff. But if you ask what Ross is actually doing, they are very silent and there are no customer reports. How successful are these tools in reality? So therefore a very intransparent market where a lot of hype is existing, where we don't know which tools are exactly doing what, and even if we contact people or vendors of these tools to participate in benchmarks, they say, yeah, we are not willing to participate in these benchmarks, yeah, because our tool is not intended for this purpose alone, it's intended for other purposes also, therefore it would be unfair to compare our tool with other tools in this sector. Yeah, and again, that's one thing I see which we now should improve, that we should really look at the existing tools and check whether they deliver to promise. And so therefore we have also in Munich, there's an event, it's called Denkfabrik Legal Tech, yeah, think tank legal tech. It's a gathering the size of this room more or less. They meet every 4 weeks somehow on the Friday afternoon. It's from the Ministry of Justice, organized in the Justice Ministry in Munich, and I'm more or less one of the moderators there, so I'm always the tech guy challenging the tech companies, and then there are also the lawyers in the room which are interested to learn more about these tools. so that we do presentations. What do this tool do, like tomorrow? Because that's, I think, what we can do if we talk about computer systems. We can show what they are doing, and we can more or less then say, okay, if this is what the tool is doing, do you think it's understandable? Do you think it's profitable? How long will it take for you to use it? And then you can also ask you people that bought or used this tool how satisfied they are. Yeah? So you don't have to write papers about robo-judges, and you don't have to write papers about AI, threats of AI and explainable AI, because some of these tools do so stupid and simple things that you don't have to think about explainable AI at all. So to summarize, I think you can classify now all these solutions into rather simple and well-understood rule-based functions which are programmed by humans to automate decision processes. You can then have functions learned by a very large number of predefined training data. And then again, the main lesson to be learned by legal experts is somebody has to create these predefined training data, and this training data should be not biased, it should be very large, and it should cover the right test cases. Or if you're very lucky, then you could find machine learning which runs in experiments in a controlled environment and learns by itself in this environment a certain behavior. So the big hype now from our PhD students is they want to go in this area because it's easier for them. They don't want to program. They want to more or less run experiments. But it's again rather difficult because once you have the results, you can compare them with some F-scores. But sometimes the F-score alone doesn't say enough about the quality and the understandability of this algorithm. So therefore you have the problems here that you have probabilistic results and you don't get exact results in 2 and 3. You have problems of traceability, explainability, and controllability of the learn function. Yeah, if it does errors, it's very hard to get out these errors of these machine learning tools. And it's also difficult to say who's responsible for the results. There's no programmer. In the end, you could lead to court if the system doesn't what it wants to do. Yeah, so therefore, there are strong challenges with this combination, with very interesting combination of machine learning and legal tech tools, which might be also a reason maybe not to go to legal use cases if you are a researcher in machine learning. But nevertheless, I want to support this conference because if we understand the problems and the difficulties from day one, it's easier also to direct the discussions and the panels to these difficulty issues. So if you now look at the future of the legal service ecosystem, this was what I promised, and again with the difficulties of talking about the future, the general trends one reads which are visualized in this slide, and the sources are shown on the slide on the bottom, and you can download the slides later on at the workshop, so that the customers are increasingly the corporate legal departments. Yeah, so there will be a growth of 7.6% in the top 150 firms. Yeah, so the big firms need more and more legal advice. If you look at banks, insurances, Google, etc., they have a lot of legal problems. So therefore, this is more or less the growing market on the customer side. And then you have new needs of customers, of individuals, and the government's notaries. And on the provider side, there's also a change projected for the future, this growth of these alternative legal suppliers, which would be legal service providers, so, which more or less manually go through large documents and tag them, or which more or less provide process services which are not informatics driven. But then you have the legal techs and the big four, which provide services, so that the market share of the law firms is not so much growing. It's also growing, which is good news, but quicker growing is this side of alternative legal suppliers. So here are the figures from last week. One of my PhD students was in Harvard, so they more or less quoted the following fields numbers, that law firms and companies in the US spend over $3 billion annually for legal tech, in this very broad sense of legal tech, yeah, in particular e-discovery. Yeah. Last week in Harvard, it was all about e-discovery, which is rather, I would say, low-level, simple document search. It's nothing about rule-based systems. It's nothing about machine learning. It's essentially searching in document collections. And actually half of these are spent in internal legal departments. Yeah? So it's in companies like BMW, Deutsche Bank, Commerzbank, Siemens, solving their internal problems. Yeah? And so therefore if you're a law student or business student who wants to start a company, don't talk to end users, yeah, flight rights, you know, the typical things, but think about the big money. What are the real problems companies have in mergers and acquisitions or in drafting very large finance statements for if you build a large equipment. A lot of banks have to go together to finance something like a railway route in China. And there's a lot of legal paperwork to be done currently, which could be automated. And again, the whole overall market for legal tech has an estimated potential of 16 billion US dollar. Yeah. Okay, so how will this then be divided more or less? Yeah? So we have this value chain now of services which could be either outsourced, yeah, so that's the idea. You have a legal advice, the top tier work where you need an academic degree in law, where you do this high quality work. Then you have maybe a legal task. For example, if you're a patent office, many people simply want to check the IP rights for a logo. Yeah, so if you want to do trademark registers and trademark checking, this can be outsourced. You don't do it yourself in your law firm, but you have somebody else doing it for you at scale. And then you have commodity legal tasks like document templates being filled out or smart contracts which are executed here. So that's what is this value chain where there are a lot of cases, but the value and the price tag is low. Yeah? And so therefore the market share could be then subdivided into internal law firm processes, outsourced ecosystem players, and legal service providers which do have a high degree of automation where informatics service or legal tech service could be used. So this leads then to the following picture, that how will legal services be provided, that inside the law, so that you have the division between large law firms or the big four, where the corporate legal departments work in close collaboration with big law firms and in parallel use legal service providers and big four services and ecosystem players, yeah, where you have an ecosystem of small add-ons to the legal platforms which are being used for these higher level parts. And then there is now this vision of medium to small law firms which are then can be found on these platforms, yeah, where you can more or less book. We have something like Teleklinik, one of our spin-offs at our from our chair. So they have a doctor, for example, as a comparison. You have a doctor, and instead to go to a doctor, you have a pool of doctors which more or less have spare time, and then over a platform you can book a doctor for consulting if you are in a foreign country and you feel sick, that you more or less matched to a matching doctor. Yeah? So therefore the doctor, you don't have a direct matching more between individuals and small corporate legal departments with individual lawyers, but more or less you have a pool of lawyers which are traded over a platform where you have ranking, something like an Amazon marketplace, where you can book services and you can rate the results. So that's more or less the big picture, where the world will be rolling if it follows more or less the area which we have seen in banking, in insurance, fintechs, insurtechs, or also mobility, so that BMW is not the dominant player anymore. It's mostly Google, Apple, people providing information management service and platforms like Android, etc. So that's, and it will take some, so it takes longer time, yeah, because since the maturity of this market is and the openness is not that high, but that's more or less the predictions you can find in many of these reports. There's a special problem, I found it in Germany. There are some dominant players which own the content. In particular, if you want to do machine learning and data-driven processes, you want to have existing court rulings, you want to have existing contracts, and so therefore there's a scarcity of these documents. Because there you have a government making a decision or making a ruling or making law, or you have a commentary being written by an expert, and then you have a paywall where this is aggregated by a company like Beck Online or Beck Verlag or LexisNexis. They own all these contracts, and therefore they are the right ones which could automate this and do machine learning and data tagging and data quality improvement on this thing. But what happens right now, they use it for their own purpose, so therefore it's not that easy for a startup to get quality data for working with these data. Yeah? And which is totally different if you go to machine learning about pictures, yeah? Cat pictures. Yeah? If you go to TensorFlow and you want to do image recognition and scene recognition, there are tons of data, of tag data for finding cats in pictures and professors in panels so that you more or less can train your data. And if you don't have training data, it's very hard to develop data-driven algorithms in the legal domain. And so therefore this is one problem, and it also seems to be the same case in Canada. This is taken from a Canadian presentation in the US, that many that the legal system, more or less the content of the legal system, is owned by a small number of firms like LexisNexis, etc. So now the question is, so if we now take this ecosystem perspective, what can we learn from other ecosystems? What did people in other ecosystems do to avoid this vertical situation that you have tiny companies all competing vertically for small fragments and without any money to invest and dying sooner or later? And one thing I think that happened to be very successful in some areas, in particular if you look at tools developed for programming or tools developed for e-commerce, it's this idea of open and shared source. Yeah? So you create something and it's not perfect, maybe sentence boundary detection. Yeah, it's a bread and butter algorithm you need. Where is the sentence beginning? Where is it ending? And if you get legal documents, it's much harder to find the boundary of sentences than if you go to an ordinary text. So it would be nice to have an open source library for German texts, for sentence boundary detection, for reference identification, entity extraction, etc. If it would be open source, then you would have an open source platform like Google, like Android, on which you can then build vertical solutions with ease. And once you find some bugs in the open source code, you have a better idea how to do sentence boundary detection, you can then make this open source. That would be one chance, yeah, to, if you have rules or semantic models of obligations and of trades and international trades, and you would have a shared model ontology of these legally relevant things like contracts, payments, whatever. Wouldn't it be nice to share this data, yeah, the semantic models? In particular, it would be nice to have standards. Yeah, I talked about standards in the patent office domain. What are the properties of a patent? Wouldn't it be nice to have also similar things in practice? We have ideas for this in research. Yeah, so I never can pronounce the standard here, legal rule ML, etc. But they are not being used in practice. Everybody's reinventing their own stuff, and they don't cooperate because Back Online has different annotations than Otto Schmidt Verlag. Otto Schmidt Verlag has other things than LexisNexis, and they don't sit together and try to share it with their competitors or with startups. Another idea would be software as a service, platform strategy. An important idea, consortia and cooperatives. If you look into the e-commerce area, there are a lot of cooperatives that Edeka, Co-op, they all have shared needs to buy something and to have logistics services, but then selling it locally. And therefore also cooperative would be something very nice. If many lawyers would sit together and say, we create an online service and the money for which we earn there, we divide amongst us, yeah, which would be a cooperative approach. Currently, I don't know of any of these activities, because everybody is thinking about their law firm and their competitors, and they keep their data and they do something, yeah, which is not very nice and intelligent. Again, we should also accept that we need more money, so we have to invest into R&D. Yeah, so there's currently the idea you go to a university and they do something for money, so you don't pay anything, the European Commission pays for something, and then you hope that the result of this European Commission project will be sustainable, which is not the case, because sooner or later these people, which if they leave their research, if they stop doing their PhD, they want to earn money with what they're doing, and they don't, therefore you need people which do invest into highly skilled people here. So this would be all market things, market-like things, and more or less innovative ideas of organizing digital content, yeah? Because data is different from physical objects, and that you can share source without losing anything. It's not like if I have the water and you have the water, but if you have information in code, we can share it and we have more value out of it. And this has to be understood by many people, and that's important things we should make clear with this conference. Then we also could have this idea to ask ourselves, maybe we also need regulatory measures. Yeah, and so this is something I'm no expert in, but in some areas it was very helpful to have market liberalization. Yeah, because currently many things are not allowed because you have to be a lawyer to do it. Yeah, so therefore there's some liberalization of this market might help to allow non-legal professionals to do legal work to a limited degree. This is up for discussion. You could also do the opposite thing. In some areas like flying or medical software, it was very helpful to have a strong regulation that you have documentation compliance rules. Yeah, in the sense that in the old days it was if BMW says or if Volkswagen says this is a device which does the control of the combustion engine, we believe that Volkswagen won't cheat. But nowadays, everybody would assume if they build such a box, they cheat. Yeah, so therefore, in companies like banks, insurances, and also now with automotive providers, or if you have flight devices for flying, Boeing, there are a lot of documentation and compliance rules which enforce you not only to make decisions, but to document how you did the decisions, based on which laws, on which rules, which would then lead to a need to be more precise. How did we make this decision? What was the reasoning about it? And how did we apply the law? And did we all the technically feasible to make sure that nobody is cheating in our company and abides to the laws and regulations? So therefore, in this case, more regulation might be helpful. Yeah? And the final thing we also saw in the banking sector, if you force people to create data which is portable, that you can say, I created a contract on one platform and now I want to move this contract or this data to another platform. I have a bank account at one bank. Now I have a right as a customer to move my bank data without any problem to some other user. And such a simple rule could help to create an open market. Yeah, and these would be things that are political things. Maybe none of us wants to do this here in this room, but these are things that could help to create a context for legal services. Okay, in the last section, I think I simply flashed through some things what we are doing. It's too much against slides, as always, if I'm giving talks. So therefore, I will also raise the abstraction level, and you can download the slides and look at it. So what's more or less the way I see forward, and why did I come here? Because it's all about collaboration. Yeah, it's about people developing services, using services, and we have to talk to each other before we can work together and be successful. And so therefore, what I think the baseline for our work is, and we will show it tomorrow also in our talk and presentation, is this design thinking, yeah? So that we want to create solutions which provide benefits to people, which use, in our case, because we want to use technology features, and which create a sustainable business model. Yeah? So it's not enough that it's feasible, that you can build it once, but you want to build a business that you can hire people which run the whole thing. And if you know design thinking, there are some intersection points where you would talk about emotional innovations. Yeah? For example, explainable and understandable legal tech would be helpful, or decentralized management of smart contracts, or participatory design of smart things could be innovations which would be beneficial for the users, yeah? That they not only get automated of the existing stuff, but they get emotional innovations. Then you also want to have functional innovations. You know all these buzzwords about smart contracts, intelligent driving, intelligent products, intelligent contracts, which more or less enforce the contract by protocols, or interactive or tokenized things, or immutable contracts. So these are all functional innovations which are possible. And maybe if we look more closely at these properties, that you find out new people and new use cases in the business domain. Okay, so therefore in our case what we did essentially is two cases. One is very close to our heart because we are from software engineering for business information systems. We took as business impact, semantic search, information services, digital legacy. For notaries, if you die and you have a digital legacy, how do you pass this on to your children or your heirs? Or digital certificate management. These are business-driven projects we are doing in the legal domain, but also what we started to do is projects for citizens, for informed patient consent. Now, if you have a treatment which maybe leads that you're dying, how should these documents be written so that users can read them? So the readability and understandability of such contracts, consent forms for patient treatment, or safety in the transfusion medicine. How can blockchain help to increase the safety in the transfusion medicine? Tomorrow we'll see examples how to help customers understand whether the terms of service they are signing or accepting, whether they are fair or not, or the rental agreements, whether they are transparent. So that's more or less the human benefits, so the end user benefits or the B2B benefits. And then we always do this together with institutions, Beck Verlag, Otto Schmidt Verlag, etc., or with startups which in this area. And then we use this array of technologies, NLP, energy, machine learning, classical software engineering, rule-based systems to build a solution which fits the needs, because many of these solutions don't need one of these technologies alone, but several of them. So these are the typical partners we are collaborating with. And as you can see, they are on the spectrum from social impact, from the Landesanwaltschaft Bayern, Verbraucherzentralen, the hospitals, or the notary association of Bavaria, over to startups like Align for compliance management, Otto Schmidt, Haufe, Springer Nature, and Sync, which are established organizations in the legal domain. Okay, and an important point now is that we also see a little bit of a challenge, in particular if you go to blockchain-based solutions, that you could build systems which are very interesting, like Libra, but then the question is, does the state want to have Libra, or does the state want to have certain kinds of tools? So therefore you always have to then not only look at this intersection of business viability, technical feasibility, and people benefits, but also law compliance, so that you don't want to build things like ransomware with blockchain, but you want to build something which has an ethical perspective and ethical law compliance in your design solution. And this is also the reason why there's so many interactions between lawyers and blockchain experts, because it's all about, is a blockchain-based solution compliant to the law, or does it circumvent the law? And that leads also discussion between lawyers and computer scientists. A final slide, I think, is what we typically do in other areas. We start with design thinking, lean user experience, and agile development. If you talk about things like blockchain-based systems in particular, but also deep learning, it's also necessary to educate the people. So before you can start any sensible interaction with practitioners, business people and IT people, you first have to create a shared understanding. What is a blockchain and what can you do with it? Because otherwise you often discuss about things which you don't have a common ground. So therefore this is also the task we see mainly in our education for students and the graduate education, the business executive education at TU Munich. Okay, and this is summarized here, that these are these initiatives we created more or less to foster this discussion, like here, of these different stakeholder groups with lectures, education projects, and also the Blockchain Bayern e.V., which will be founded next week. So I'm one of the co-founders. We are very happy. We have 360 people coming to this initial event, and it's done in collaboration with the IHK and the Center of Digitalization of Bavaria. And we have a lot of people from different areas, like here, because we think it's very important to have this discussion between legal people, IT people, business people, customers, suppliers, and regulators in one room, because then we can more or less have this discussion for sustainable solutions which could come in the future. Thank you very much for your attention, and so we have later on a discussion.
We would have actually scheduled a break, but I would suggest, Armin, if you don't mind, that we do the discussion now and have the break afterwards, because it might be better context for everybody. And we are in time, so we have about 30 minutes for a discussion and then 45 minutes coffee break to get fresh air and whatever in terms of support you need. The format is now that Armin Chor is a professor here at the Technical University in Vienna, but also a chairman of Secure Business Austria, an expert in logic programming as well. We'll discuss with the two gentlemen about their presentation.
Wir müssen alle aufs Klo, oder rauchen.
So I have to thank both speakers for very inspiring talks. First, perhaps I could ask Professor Robert Kowalski on this kind of logical English, which is, I think, easier to understand programs. And do you think that in the future there will be the possibility to write law in logical English, so we don't need this kind of transformation from the documents in English and translate it to logical English?
Well, I think logical English is going to be very hard to write. It's easy. It should be easy to read, but requires a lot of discipline to write correctly. What I anticipate is it's just like legislation. Well-written legislation can only be done by a very small number of very skilled people. Most people are very bad at writing.
That is the question. So if these very skilled people, could they write this in logical English in the future?
Well, so in a sense, you need a hybrid between programmers today who are able to write very precise, unambiguous, low-level code. Why should it be low-level? So they should have the ability to write higher-level code as well, which is natural language code. So this is, but in the meanwhile, it's to write good code is hard. So one of the solutions is that you have to have good examples. So this is what's I would say the bottleneck at the moment is we have very few examples of well-written. First of all, well-written natural language. I mean, the British Nationality Act is viewed in computational terms. It's written far better than any software engineer ever wrote any specification in English. It is very clearly, very precisely written. But we have to have examples, and people have to learn to write. I mean, I would say we have to teach children that language is not just poetry. Language also has meaning. And there is a gap in children's education. They're taught to write creatively and entertainingly. They're not taught that words have meanings and that sentences put meaning together. So, yeah, maybe that'll be a bottleneck. Thank you. That's a good question.
On the other side, it reminds me to many years ago when IBM started to formulate some logical rules for hit and run offenses. And this needs more than 1 year just to translate one paragraph. Yeah. So that would be too intensive for real world problems. So may I ask the audience for some questions to Professor Kowalski? Yeah, please.
Is English not an inherently bad language, to be precise, as opposed to German or French, for example?
Well, I learned Latin. Latin is a bit better than English because the syntactic cases in Latin are closer to the semantic meaning. So in English, there's a very rough correspondence between the prepositions and the syntax. So to, the for, of these prepositions in English don't have a very clear semantics, whereas in Latin the semantics is much more possessive. You have concept, possessive, locative, instrumental. So English may not be, well, so logical English, each preposition will have to have a clear semantic meaning. So English, I'm looking at a sub-language of English, but also from an expression and difficulty. One of the problems with writing logic, as you say at IBM, is that it's too restrictive. At the purely object level, you cannot talk about an obligation. You cannot mix meta level and object level. So there are restrictions that will be lifted from ordinary logic, but so we need to make logic less restrictive and English more restrictive. But I agree that English is only one example that I know better than other languages. But I'd like to know a more logical language.
I think it's from a user perspective, writing, for example, a contract in English as opposed to writing a contract in German. Writing it in German, you'd get by with much fewer definitions and clarifications than it would in English. And then the discussing afterwards, the negotiation, I find there's just much more use of softener words, like a reasonable time frame and nonsense like that. So is it the user or is it the language?
Well, there's a style, there's stylistic, there's a stylistic element. What style do you use in whatever language you have? And the same is true in logical English. There are many styles, like it is obligatory that is one style, but it is an obligation that. And one style offers more expressive capability and means you can express things which are harder in more traditional logic. But I mean, I agree, I would love to find a more logical, natural language than English. And I've been looking for them, but there's very little analysis as far as, I mean, I've been told, for example, that Chinese is more logical than English, but I don't know.
Professor Mattes has a remark on this.
Yeah, so I think the interesting point is, the funny thing is computer scientists and lawyers, they are the most hated groups in the company. Yeah, so the lawyers do things that nobody understands and they always say it's impossible. So it's the cliche. And then the computer science, they build software nobody understands and that breaks. Yeah. So therefore, but now I think the future will be the case that actually we will write these smart contracts for derivatives, or we have maybe the calculation of the bonus of a sales employee. So these are things which are calculated. So we have algorithms. So I see the future that we will not first, that we also have a situation where we have, let's say, a decision system at the university whether somebody is accepted or not. Yeah? And there somebody will write a code that executes this, and now we have the need that somebody can understand what this code is doing. Yeah? So therefore I could also see a situation where such a structured language and a structured design of programming language might help to have code which is executable in the first place to make it understandable. Yeah? Because currently you have textual descriptions, requirements, and then some magic creative process to create code which is tested to be something. And it would be nice to look at the code in a way that a lawyer or law expert with some training could understand what's going on, because it's better to understand. And then I totally agree with you that maybe some of these machine systems are maybe not the easiest way to understand it. Yeah? And we have a lot of automation everywhere around us, and so therefore it would be nice that this automation can be understood, the rules at least.
I think in some way language in law is the most viable way for translation, because we have already the Dikatom, etc. And if we look to Google Translate, the first corpora used was the corpora of the Canadian Parliament, and this was the impetus to do further. This was this groundbreaking work of Franz Joseph Ochs to say, okay, we just take the corpora in French and the corpora in English, and then let machine learn. And this was the starting point of Google Translate, for example. So in some way, language has some logic behind it, as you have pointed out. Are there some things?
I am pretty good. I've actually got two questions, one for Professor Mattes and one for Professor Kowalski. The one question for Professor Mattes would be, you're talking about the legal departments and of the companies as the major customers. Don't you think it is very important, or it would be more important also to include general managers and the CEOs, because they also need to know what's going on, especially in the legal tech development, talking about logical English, logical German, or however you might call it, the logic language behind it, because I think otherwise they don't understand the vastness of what's coming on here to all the companies, because I don't think that there would happen anything bad by having an unfiltered or unbiased intentionally anything, but if you get filtered messages or biased messages, I think they need to know what's going on. Do you include them? That's the basic questions. Do you include the CEOs in all your lectures and in all your group discussions that you have when you talk about corporations?
So implicitly, I think, for example, all this compliance, what Align is doing, these are spin-off of McKinsey, etc. So there's a huge pain now with the DSGVO and all these compliance regulations that they hit immediately the board of directors. So therefore, they are responsible, which is good. Yeah, and that makes them highly interested in what's going on in the legal department and with compliance. Yeah, I think that was a strategic move, which is very well done, on also increasing the fines for violations. Yeah, so therefore they are motivated this way. But nevertheless they want to push it down because obviously it's not doable. So therefore what we now need somehow is this chain of responsibility. And then again, these are classical so you want to partition now the company that with enterprise architecture and say, okay, what are our processes and where can anything go wrong? So therefore you have this classical idea of separating the capabilities of the organization and then having processes in place to educate people, to train people, to observe stuff. So therefore I think there's a high interest of the top management to have automation there and dashboards and magic things which somehow make sure that the people do the right things. And there are, for example, initiatives in Daimler, BMW and Volkswagen, that they have a shared database of legal regulations worldwide affecting cars. Yeah, because there are so many countries, who should know what is now the last regulation in South Korea? So therefore they have a shared interest, cross-organizational, to build a shared database of regulations so that they then can inform the stakeholders that there's a new regulation out there. Yeah? So I think we are now, and since the problem is so large, there are so many countries, so many parts and pieces in a car, so many software in the car, they now have to find IT solutions to help them managing the laws. What is written there? Is it about the light? Is it about the distance to the bottom of the car? Is it the combustion exhaust? So that's, I think, the problem, that we now have day-to-day a vast problem of regulating organizations, and the organizations now need some support, and currently it's done with a lot of intern lawyers and managers to do the right thing at scale. Yeah? And so that would be my answer, that they are very much motivated. They're also willing to pay money, which is what I say. Yeah? So there is a lot of money for this big four to do this and to check that there's regulation, because if they checked it, they showed that they are investing in it. Yeah? So there's easily earned money in this field with rather stupid things. Yeah? It's checkboxes, checklists, they have been trained, they have been expressed. You know what I mean?
And your question to...
And my second question to Professor Kowalski would be, when we talk about this logic language, if everything comes down to then somehow to artificial intelligence somehow, artificial intelligence with this if, so, then relations, how will they be able to include ethical things? When we're talking about autonomous cars, for instance, there must be a decision. I think about a road approached with just autonomous cars driving, and then there is this famous situation, something happens because a little child runs into the street, and how will the algorithm then be programmed? Will the algorithm just then protect its own driver, or will it bump into the little child, or so on? So my question is, I guess a really big one, how will you be able, or how will science be able to include the ethical questions then into this logics, into this semantic programming when we talk about artificial intelligence?
Okay, this is a much bigger question than my talk, but it is a question which I addressed in my book on computational logic and human thinking. Logic is one of two main components that go into human behavior, and the other is rationality as understood by psychologists and economists. So in artificial intelligence and in the academic community, these two fields are more or less disjoint, although they do come together to some extent in artificial intelligence, where models have been built of human thinking, which could be implemented by computer for computer thinking, which incorporate both logic and theoretic decision. Theory.
How will the algorithm then be programmed? Will the algorithm just then protect its own driver, or will it bump into the little child, or so on? So my question is, I guess a really big one, how will you be able, or how will science be able to include the ethical questions then into this logics, into this semantic programming when we talk about artificial intelligence?
Okay, this is a much bigger question than my talk, but it is a question which I addressed in my book on computational logic and human thinking. Logic is one of two main components that go into human behavior, and the other is rationality as understood by psychologists and economists. So in artificial intelligence and in the academic community, these two fields are more or less disjoint, although they do come together to some extent in artificial intelligence, where models have been built of human thinking, which could be implemented by computer for computer thinking, which incorporate both logic and decision theory.
how will the algorithm then be programmed? Will the algorithm just then protect then its own driver, or will it bump into the little child, or so on? So my question is, I guess a really big one, how will you be able, or how will science be able to include the ethical questions then into this logics, into this semantic programming when we talk about artificial intelligence?
Okay, this is a much bigger question than my talk, but it is a question which I addressed in my book on computational logic and human thinking. Logic is one of two main components that go into human behavior, and the other is rationality as understood by psychologists and economists. So in artificial intelligence and in the academic community, these two fields are more or less disjoint, although they do come together to some extent in artificial intelligence, where models have been built of human thinking, which could be implemented by computer for computer thinking, which incorporate both logic and decision theory
how will the algorithm then be programmed? Will the algorithm just then protect then its own driver?
SMEs. This could be, and then there are even some patents on this that this even could be translated to advanced geometry. So KI could even be how to say, an enabler of putting data together, even of smaller enterprises, and that is a real nice research going on.
But again, the problem now, so there's a project it's called Differential Privacy, and Facebook is funding now TU Munich to investigate this. If you have very large numbers of data, then you can provably create changes in this data that individual data items cannot be identified in patient records. And unfortunately, this only works if you have very much data. Yeah? So therefore, again, what you need is you have to be a player like Google, Facebook, Apple, which have large amounts of data. And again, now it would help if you have cooperatives that German small, medium-sized enterprises would say, okay, maybe we put our small things together and create now these large data sets in which we can do these anonymization techniques. But again, it's a new way of thinking. I agree that there may be this idea of gold leads into a different direction. So like Gollum, my Schatz. Yeah. So that should keep it.
It's gold and asbestos, I should. Is there some last question here? Yes, please.
I want to add some point here from a legal publisher perspective, because I think you're totally right when you're saying that the technology, the barrier to adopting technology is getting lower and lower, because the big companies are providing the platform to do that. But you never know what will happen in the future when they are changing their business model, for example. So maybe you end up in the same situation as in the data perspective, where few big companies own the platforms, and you are relying on those platforms.
So I think we are, I don't know, we are running out of time. It's okay, yeah. So, yeah.
I think this is again what you have posted in your talk, that the data must be shared.
Open data. Yeah.
Take your data out of one platform and put it to the next one. So this is of interoperability of the data, so that you really can take your data with you. Which is now the case, for example, of your bank accounts or some new things, and it will be more and more with other services. But currently, this is not the case.
Okay. Well, then thank you. I need to unfortunately stop you here because so far we are good in time. 2 or 3 remarks. One is actually the issue of anonymizing data and using it and feeding it into the system is a topic at tomorrow's workshop of Mr. Langthaler as well, where we, from the Austrian Informatics Center, and our situation in Austria is a bit better than in Germany because all court judgments, for example, as they are published by the risk system, are available. So it's less of a restricted system. The second thing is, if you're really interested in logic, language, and law, there's an interesting author to read after, that's Lawrence Lessig of Harvard, before Stanford, who writes about code is law. So if you have time, Google Lawrence Lessig and code is law. There's this interesting notion, which in particular for compliance is very important, whether or not, for example, you can word your compliance regulations so that you can automate them, which is an interesting theory and I think probably workable, probably not so much for normal law. And the most important thing is now we have a coffee break. Thank you very much for your attention so far. I would be really grateful if you could be back in time at 4:15, so 16:15, 4:15, please. Thank you. And an applause to our panel, please.